come in.
Sure.
So thank you so much, Seyward, for coming to speak with us. We spent last week talking about kind of the long civil rights movement. Where am I? There I am. And it was really helpful to have your piece kind of bring us up to date. So I wanted to have you talk a little bit. I know you want to have more questions and answers, which is great. But if you could talk a little bit about how you came to the topic, how you approached it, and some of the, I know that Stephanie, is Stephanie there? I know that Stephanie's in this class and she interviewed you for the Chronicle.
Oh yes, hi, nice to see you again.
Yeah. And Stephanie did a great interview with you, which I also shared with the class. I think it would be interesting to talk about how you kind of approached the personal relationships with some of the women you interviewed and how you kept, both a sense of, I don't want to call it objective, but you kept a sense of reporting while at the same time dealing with some really difficult ideas. But I'm going to hand it over to you as a Duke alum, and also if you're interested in asking Seyward about how she got to be her fabulous self, please do. I think that's always interesting for students. But I want to hand it over to you, and thank you so much for coming, and tell us a little bit how you got to the ideas of the book.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I feel very old to be speaking as a Duke alum. I graduated in 2007. I started this topic immediately, or started focusing on this topic immediately after the 2016 election. So I've been a journalist for a long time, ever since, I was a journalist at Duke, and then since graduating, that's been my only career. And so I covered a lot of things: education policy, political campaigns, foreign policy, human rights, a variety of things. And in the wake of the 2016 election, I just felt very strongly that, I wanted to respond to the moment somehow. And I was struck in the weeks immediately following the election when people were talking about the rise of white nationalism, or the resurgence, I should say, of white nationalism, and particularly the then so-called alt-right, that nobody ever talked about women. Nobody ever mentioned that women were at events for the alt-right. Nobody ever quoted a woman who supported the alt-right. And on the one hand, it's a hyper-misogynistic space, and so perhaps that was logical to people, but women have long been involved in hyper-misogynistic movements. Phyllis Schlafly is perhaps, the most famous of those figures from the Stop the Equal Rights Amendment movement. And so I just decided I wanted to know more. I wanted to know where these women were. I wanted to know who they were. I wanted to know why they believed in a vision of America that was so radically different from my own. So, the research really started on Google. It wasn't terribly exciting or glamorous. I just started looking for YouTube pundits and Twitter types and women who were using various social media platforms to promote the ideas of the alt-right. And they weren't hard to find. There were quite a few of them. And to your question about how I approached them individually, I pitched this idea to Harper's Magazine that I wanted to write about these women and the role that they played in the alt-right and what the appeal of the alt-right might be to women. And my editor and I actually talked at length about how to approach the issue, because there was a real chance that no one was going to speak to me. That if I said, who I was, they could easily Google me and see that I'd worked for liberal publications, that I, identified as a progressive, and that they might say, no, you're the enemy. And you have to remember, this is, 2016, like Trump had already, been planting these seeds of fake news and, media is enemy of the state and all this stuff. And so there was a real chance they were just going to say no. So there was a world in which I could have presented myself under false pretenses. So I could have come up with a whole different identity for myself, different motives for why I wanted to tell this story. But my editor and I both agreed from an ethical standpoint that we would prefer that I at least try to get them to speak to me based on who I really was and what I really believe. So my ask in emails and direct messages and other modes of outreach was essentially this is who I am. This is what I believe. Like, I did not vote for Trump. I find what he believes to be abhorrent. But as a journalist and as a white woman, I am very interested to understand your story and how you came to believe what you believe. And I just want to listen, basically. And I did get a lot of no's and a few not safe for work no's, language wise. This is not a space that's known for its decorum. And then I got a few yeses, and a few of those yeses led to other yeses because, you know, people in the space were friendly with each other, and, you know, somebody would say, she's fine to talk to, you know, go ahead and, you know, accept her interview request. So in speaking to them, I made a pact with myself that I was never going to argue with them, because the most important thing, and this is sort of just a journalistic axiom, is to keep people talking. You just want to keep them talking. And I knew that arguing would take me down rabbit holes, because these are not good faith actors. These are not people who are coming to the table with any interest in changing their own minds. On top of that, the things they believe and the ideas upon which those beliefs are based are often filled with lies or bad data or any number of things that would make it an unfair fight. It would sort of be like coming to the table with apples and oranges. Not that those are weapons, but you know what I mean. And so I made a pact with myself that I wasn't going to argue with them. And that was hard because, of course, they would, you know, in conversations say really upsetting things, things that I knew to be false. And in those moments, you know, certainly I would prod them. I would say, well, you know, I have heard, or like I have read, or have you thought about, but it never from the standpoint of confronting, because I just wanted to keep them talking. And the other thing I told myself, you know, at the time, and this certainly extended into the book, was I'm going to be able to bring my perspective to the actual writing of this story and eventually of this book. So, you know, if I wanted to point out errors, I could do that on the page. And I think that an obvious follow-up to that, or a question people might have, is, well, what good does that do if, you know, what they believe is not only, you know, unethical but false? You know, shouldn't you be, you know, are trying to change their minds, trying to show them the truth? And on the one hand, sure, I don't necessarily see that as my role as a journalist. But on top of that, psychological studies show that people do not like to be told that they're wrong. They do not like to be confronted with the truth. And it's something that I actually write about at length in my book, because I think that this issue of how do you know, confront someone who believes deeply racist ideas, or more recently, how do you confront someone who believes in QAnon or another conspiracy theory, you know, really research shows that confrontation is not the way to go, because that can often lead people to double down on their beliefs. And that's not the direction you want to go. So the point being, my decision to not, you know, really confront was informed, first of all, by trying to get people to talk to me as much as they would, or, you know, were willing. And also because I did not really see a utility in it from any, you know, practical standpoint. So I wrote this piece about the women of the alt-right, and it was published the week that Charlottesville happened. I find it so interesting that there are these events in history where they just come to be known by the place name. So, you know, Oklahoma City, or, you know, in this case, Charlottesville. And so Charlottesville happened. I assume everybody knows what that means. And I had reached that point in working on a project writing-wise where I couldn't see the forest for the trees. I really wasn't sure if anybody cared about this topic. And then Charlottesville happened, and it was pretty clear that people did care about the topic. And so that led me to work on a book proposal with my agent, who's also a Duke alum, Adam Eaglin, who your professor knows, and sold the book. And then I had 18 months to write it. And it involved certainly lots more interviews, and I expanded the book, or the topic, I should say, and I looked at a lot more historical dimensions, looking at the ways in which women have been integral to the perpetuation of white supremacy since the end of I mean, certainly they were integral to the perpetuation of white supremacy before the Civil War, but if you see the Civil War as kind of a breach in history where a large number of white Americans felt that something had been lost and that there was something that they needed to regain. That is like the dawning of white nationalism as we know it. Whiteness as a political movement, as a tool. And so I looked deeply at women's roles in the lost cause, like the building of this idea of the lost cause, all of the women who erected, Confederate statues around the South. The vast majority of those statues that people are arguing about and tearing down were funded by women. Women's roles in the Ku Klux Klan. A woman was arguably the most important propagandist of the Ku Klux Klan at its zenith. And then up through, I did look at Nazi Germany because Nazism, first of all, took huge cues from white supremacy in the United States, which I think is something that often gets kind of lost in the history of World War II, that Hitler and the Nazis were very deeply inspired by the eugenics movement in the United States, by Jim Crow, and by even the Klan. So I looked at Nazism and then moved into what we think of as white nationalism today. So neo-Nazi movements, paramilitary movements, all of which are sort of united around this idea of white power, and looked at resistance to the civil rights movement. So if you've been studying the civil rights movement, sounds like for the last couple of weeks, the ways in which when we think about resistance to civil rights, we often think about violence. And so we think about, police violence against protesters, or you think about lynchings, or you think about extrajudicial, other forms of extrajudicial killings. But women were incredibly important actors and very effective actors in actually resisting the real policies of civil rights, particularly integration in schools and communities. And then I brought it up to the present day. So I spent a lot of time thinking about some of the worst forces in American history, and the ways in which women have played important but really overlooked roles. And I think that there's I think one of the things that really drew me to this project was, here you have this very misogynistic space in which traditional gender roles and femininity, white femininity, are these very prized things. And so it is very sexist, very misogynistic. But at the same time, the fact that we assume within that women have no agency, that women have no, real ability to shape a movement, to shape strategy, to shape ideals, is its own form of sexism. And so sexism has, I think, blinded a lot of people to the ways in which women have been incredibly important in upholding this space. And that's also something that women in the space use to their advantage. They know that they are seen as nicer, more palatable than, violent male actors, for instance, or just male actors, period. So that's a very long ramble for how I got from there to here. But that was, I really started my research about 4 years and 2 months ago. So this has been basically the equivalent of your college careers once you're done with college, dedicated to this topic. So, yeah.
One follow-up. Were you raised in North Carolina?
I was, yes. So I was raised about 2 hours east of Duke in Greenville. So I'm just wondering, when you engaged with this, especially the long history, how much did you have to teach yourself about the history of North Carolina? How much did you already know? Mm-hmm. Like, were you surprised by what you found during your research? Yeah, no, that's a great question. I felt like I was pretty well informed, for any number of reasons, just because it was, just social justice and civil rights were things that I cared about. And yet, in reading about these, particularly chapters in history, I really was stunned by how much I didn't know, by how much had been kind of, I don't know, if I knew about it, it had been taught to me in a very softened way. I knew about the Greensboro Massacre in 1979, which is a really pivotal moment in white nationalist history. And interesting fact about the Greensboro Massacre, which was a clash between, if you don't know, very briefly, left-leaning organizers, communist organizers, people who were essentially pro-labor, clashing with Klan and neo-Nazi members. And the Klan and neo-Nazi people in Greensboro opened fire, people died. It was very bad. This happened, I want to say a week before the Iran hostage crisis happened. So it's this pivotal moment. It was very important historically in any number of ways, but it got minimized because these things have often gotten minimized because white legacy institutions, including the government, are keen to kind of, deal with these things and move on, as opposed to seeing them as, connected to wider history. But also there was this huge international crisis happening that kind of overtook it as news, which I had never put together, but a historian who writes pretty exclusively about that period kind of explained those dynamics. So, I think that my family's been in the South for a really long time. As far as I know, my mom's family fought for the Confederacy. I'm pretty sure they owned slaves at some point. I don't think they were like plantation owners, but they, were very much part of a racist system in the South. And I felt like I had a pretty good grasp on that. And yet I learned so much, and I was amazed by the things I didn't know. That I felt like I should have known, that should have been, part of a American history or state history curriculum.
Yeah. And I just want to do one final question and then open it to the room. So you've written this book and you are primed to understand and see what happened after the election and on January 6th in a pretty important way. So how would you describe like what you saw and what you're seeing now, and then what you are looking for in the near future in terms of the women in this movement? Do any of them, do you still correspond with any of them? Where are they? What are they thinking? I think one of them has kind of left to do something else. And so if you could just talk about like how you saw the post-election January 6th events, and then what you're looking for in the future.
Yeah, well, I will confess that I am not an optimist. And so immediately after the election, I mean, first of all, they were, if you, you don't even have to look very hard online. I mean, certainly you had Trump, spouting all of these falsehoods and, conspiracy theories about the election, and essentially encouraging people to support them and to fight on his behalf. But then if you looked on various social media platforms, from Twitter to Gab to Parler to Telegram to Facebook, just everywhere, people were really broadcasting that what they wanted to do was go to DC and fight for what they believed had been stolen. So I was not at all surprised by what happened on January 6th. And I was, as ever, and I feel like this has been kind of a common reaction of mine over the last couple of years, is when something like this happens, whether you're talking about January 6th or you're talking about Charlottesville, and people are shocked, I'm shocked that people are shocked. But I also recognize that, these are issues that I'm really like close to and I'm paying attention to. But in the case of January 6th, I kind of see it as having these like concentric circles where you shouldn't have been shocked if you were paying attention to what was happening with regard to, Trump's rhetoric after the election and ways in which far-right actors were communicating online. And I will also add that, the people who actually set up that day on January 6th, like the speakers and the pomp and circumstance of the Stop the Steal event, that was all women. The Women for Trump, they're like two different organizations. It's all cross-pollinated. But anyway, point being, it was women who organized that day. But then if you look pre-election, Trump had spent 4 years, and the far right had, been aping everything he said for 4 years, that any outcome of this election that was not in his favor would necessarily be illegitimate. And so again, these seeds had been planted and they'd been nourished for so long. And then if you look even before Trump was elected, and you go back, years, decades, actors on the far right had been saying that this is exactly the kind of event they were heading for. And it was a fantasy almost of what does it look like when we rise up against tyranny, as they describe it. What does it look like when we go to Washington and demand, justice for white America? And so there were a lot of different ways in which January 6th was almost like pieces falling into place, pieces that had been floating around, that had been certainly amplified over the last couple of years. And then it was like they all clicked. And I think going forward, I mean, I'm glad that people are talking about these issues in a way that perhaps they were not before. But we are also not a country, and I don't know, maybe this is just human nature, not great with attention spans. And we are quick to move on to the next thing that we decide matters. Of course, we are also in a world historical health crisis, so there is a lot to deal with right now. But my biggest concern post January 6th is that the reaction will be very consolidated in law enforcement, that people will see solutions as necessarily a matter of law enforcement. So arresting perpetrators, charging perpetrators, creating new domestic terrorism statutes, which will almost certainly be used in bad ways, as we have seen certainly in the post 9/11 period, and not against the people who, they're designed for. And I think that this gets to a arguably bigger problem in American society and culture, which is our kind of obsession with law enforcement solutions, seeing a threat to security and saying, okay, we need to quash that. And the problem here is that, this is coming from like a very deep well of white supremacy dating back so far. And so if you deal with it merely from a law enforcement standpoint, you're not really dealing with the problem. And so I saw yesterday, I think, on this website that I'm a huge nerd that covers education policy and updates in the education system in the United States, that there have been some proposals to kind of reevaluate historical curricula in public schools and to kind of rethink how we talk about certain facets of American history and whiteness in American history. And that, to me, those kinds of solutions, this is an all hands on deck situation where it's not just law enforcement, it's not just education, it's so many institutions and forces that are required to really confront this history and say, okay, how do we stop this from happening again? Not just how do we punish people for what has happened, which, to be clear, it was a coup attempt. People should be punished, but like that's democracy. But that's only just one piece of the puzzle. So I think it's really crucial to think about solutions more broadly. And I think the last thing I'll say about this, and why another reason this is so important, is because in the past, when people have sought strictly law enforcement solutions to white nationalism, it's actually then been valorized the ways in which people have been prosecuted, people have been treated by the government. They actually become martyrs in a way, and become symbols to the movement. And so I think that's another thing to be attentive to, is that just because you arrest somebody, charge somebody, and to be clear, unclear what will happen to them, if trials go forward and whatnot. But that's not a clear negative for people who support white nationalism, because those figures can really be held up as symbols. So I don't know, I guess I'm very anxious and kind of, attentive to a lot of different ways in which people in this space who I follow, are talking about these issues. Oh, to your question, the women who I spoke to for my book. So one of them left not a long time ago, but like 8 or 9 years ago. She left white nationalism, and she's the one I wrote about for the New York Times, which I think you said you shared that piece with the class. And she's still very much not involved. One of the women has retired politically, which I find to be a very fascinating statement, which basically means she doesn't post on social media anymore. But I think that is a convenient way of saying, anything I do in my immediate family or in my community or my social networks is not political. But it is, because, so much of women's roles in white nationalism have been about perpetuating white supremacy in sort of more intimate circumstances. So retired politically mostly just means she also got banned from a bunch of platforms, so it's hard for her to communicate in the way she used to. And then the last one, man, she's still going strong. She and her husband still have this platform that they run that has tens of thousands of followers on, a single social media platforms. So you know, then look at, if you added it all up, they have a pretty huge following. She live tweets things like January 6th. She live tweets things like, you know, the impeachment hearings. And I'm trying to remember on January 6th, because anytime something's happening, like from a news standpoint, I always go to check and see what she's saying. And it's sort of like going through the looking glass to be, you know, seeing what journalists actually on the ground are saying about what's happening, and then go to her pages and see her bizarre interpretation. But I think she said something on January 6th that I screenshot that was it was along the lines of, you know, what do you expect when people have been oppressed? Of course they're going to rise up, or something along those lines. So she certainly sees no problem with what happened on January 6th. She was in communication with me until about a year ago, a little under a year ago. She wouldn't necessarily agree to see me again because she decided I was according to the video she made about me denouncing my book, I'm a liberal feminist childless cat lady, all of which
What
is
a burn.
yeah, such a burn. I mean, I mean, all of which is true. I also have a dog. Yeah, so she had stopped doing interviews with me, but she would, if I sent her a message, she would always reply. And so I ended up getting like more from her in a more informal way. And then she officially blocked me and stopped all communication when my fact checker for the book reached out to her. For whatever reason, that was the moment she decided to block me, but I can just access her accounts through other means. So sorry, that's a very, very long answer.
No, that's great. Thank you. Professor Kuntz has joined us. Claudia, do you want to say something while you're here?
Well, yes, actually, I was just putting together a talk this afternoon about right-wing women in Hitler Germany. And so I can't, when you were describing the disorder, I joined another class yesterday for a colleague of mine in New York. And what the students and I were so surprised at is how incredibly orderly the women were everyone was in all of these rallies, that the traditional fascists wanted control above everything. They wanted centralized government. They expelled people from their movement. There was a pyramid, there was a hierarchy. Women were really important because it gave a brutal masculine movement. This is so much like your book, gave a brutal masculine movement a kind of feminine human face, but it was so hierarchical and so organized. And what we're looking at now, partly because of social media, but also because of the reality TV that produced The Leader, we're looking at a movement out of control. Mm-hmm. Somebody once said that Trump destroys centralization, that he truly stands for anarchists. He's like a 5-year-old who douses a couch with kerosene and lights a match and says, "Ooh, what's going to happen?" So these comments were coming from my students and from me too, and it made us more frightened about the present.
I could not agree more. And first of all, I don't know that we've ever had the pleasure of speaking, but your book was so incredibly important for me.
Well, I have your book. I have the only copy out of the library. It's wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. No, it was hugely like foundational for me, grasping gender issues in this space. But I think you're absolutely right. You know, I think often about a comment made by Andrew Anglin, who is a neo-Nazi who started the website The Daily Stormer, and he's a particularly odious character. But this was, 2015, 2016, and he made a comment once, not verbally, but on the website, that the mob is the movement. And I think that is so true, and that the disorder is terrifying to me because I think it also masks more order than we realize exists, or maybe not hierarchical order, but at least, you know, modes of communication and certain, you know, respect for certain voices of authority that beneath the disorder on social media or on, you know, platforms that we can't even see there is more communication and organization. January 6th is a good example of this, because if you got online and people were saying, we're going to the Capitol, we're going to the Capitol, it was like, I don't know, do I take this seriously? Like, this is just some guy like in Kansas or some lady in Michigan. But then you saw, the Oath Keepers, for instance, who are a far-right paramilitary movement. They were hyper organized. They had like state leaders and people who reported to those leaders, and they were organizing, who was going to go to the Capitol. And this is all stuff that has been, more exposed in the aftermath of January 6th. And I really do think the disorder is scary because it's hard to map and hard to know what to take seriously as a threat. But it also, it's very functional for them, because then they're able to say, oh, well, this is just chaos.
Right.
And behind the scenes, it's actually less chaotic than it appears. So yeah, no, I'm really not an optimist. Sorry, guys.
No, and the other part of this too is what Nancy McLean has unearthed, and that is that it may very well be the mob is unorganized, but the Koch brothers, the money and politics is extremely well organized.
Yes.
And so there's a terrible contrast, both outside the government. One, let's call them the Koch brothers network, which is high finance, pushing the government. And then there's the disorganized mob that is really finding. And the other peculiar paradox of Nazism, and I think of all interwar fascisms, is that actually in real life, there was a lot of disorder. They produced an image of orderliness on the surface that actually allowed for individual local initiative, and that carried right through to 1945. And so, but there was always an effort, an immediate effort made to make this look orderly. That effort is no longer, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Anymore.
I think you're right. It's reversed almost, where
almost. Yeah, you're right. You're right.
An effort to make it seem disorderly,
yeah.
which it is, to be clear.
Which it is.
But I think the other thing I find fascinating about this is anytime something happens that is not January 6th, because they don't see that as
that's right,
a bad thing, right? But Dylan Roof killing, parishioners at Mother Emanuel in South Carolina, James Fields running Heather Heyer over and killing her in Charlottesville. The disorder is also a way that then people can distance themselves from those acts and say, well, I had nothing to do with that, or my beliefs had nothing to do with that. I've never even met that person. I never saw him at a conference. I never, I don't know, he didn't follow me on Twitter or whatever it may be. Where if you then dig a little deeper, you'll find them saying very positive things about these people, because they, see them as soldiers in the fight. But the disorder allows them in a public sense to say, no, I'm not saying that we should do that. I'm, saying that I just stand for the rights of white people. So a good example, actually, I'm going to read something from my book, because I think this gets to, just have to remember what page it's on, because gosh, I have not opened my own book in a while. So I was talking to one of my sources, Lana Locktough. She's the one who's still going strong. And I interviewed her in Charleston. So we were a couple of blocks away, maybe like a 7-minute walk from Mother Emanuel, where Dylan Roof killed all those people. And so let's see, with Roof in mind and with Mother Emanuel a half-mile away from where we sat, I asked Lana about violence. Did she worry about people in her political camp committing it? No, she said, following up the firm rejection with a comment that I didn't expect. You should never denounce an extremist on your side. We were sitting inside the restaurant by then, blah, blah, blah. You don't need to know all about where we were sitting. When does the left do that? Lana continued. When did they ever denounce Antifa violence or people punching people or resorting to whatever kind of violence? They never do that. Shifting attention to Antifa was a fallacious strategy the far right employed with vigor, to the point that in 2019, Trump would suggest that the leftist cohort be labeled a terror organization. I ignored Lana's whataboutism. So I asked, you shouldn't denounce people who advocate violence. Lana seemed to calculate a course correction, a semantic one. Alt-right people don't. I've never heard anyone say, oh yeah, let's go out and kill people. People try to link people to us that aren't us. Later, in an email, Lana wrote that she wanted to be crystal fucking clear that she was not implying that Roof was on her side. She described alleged peculiarities in the case against him, hint at a possible conspiracy against or involving him. But she also wrote, quote, "It's frustrating he learned about the reality of interracial crime. This possibly could have been prevented by having an honest discussion about it in the media. It never happens. The bottom line," she insisted, was that, quote, "the alt-right has never killed anyone. Unite the Right and Heather Heyer's murder was just 4 months in the future." So I think that that's a good like example of the ways in which they do these kind of rhetorical gymnastics. And if you had when Dylan Roof committed his crime, I went and watched the videos that Lana and her husband made in the immediate aftermath, because that would have been before I knew about her and was working on this project. And they just spouted conspiracy theories about it. There was no denunciation. It was all, some way in which he had been like the real victim of injustice. But in talking to me, she was clearly trying to, she was trying a couple of different rhetorical strategies to make it seem like what she believed and the people she associated with and the vision she had for America had nothing to do with him. So anyway.
Well, let's, if someone online has a question, just jump in, because I can't really see everybody. So if you have a question, unmute yourself and just go ahead and ask.
I have a quick question. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more to other solutions that you think could help address this situation.
Man, you've asked about like the one thing that my publisher wishes I were better at, which is solutions, because I am such a pessimist. But, I think that I saw somebody mentioned the Truth and Reconciliation process in Greensboro. I don't know what that would look like at a national scale, but I do think that there are lessons to be taken from Truth and Reconciliation processes in other countries. And this gets to my point earlier about how law enforcement is only one piece of the solution. And I also think that certainly educational curricula that reevaluates the way that we talk about things like the Civil War, like civil rights, like the resistance to civil rights, and honestly about the rise of right-wing violence in the last several decades. That's something that has been, you all know what Oklahoma City was. You all know what Dylan Roof did. There are these isolated incidents that people know about, but they were not taught in a historical sense how they all connect. The ways in which like certain texts, certain individuals, certain movements actually provide through lines. And so I think that, speaking more honestly about where right-wing violence was coming from, and the less violent movements that they were connected to, that were still very anti-progress. But this is kind of to Professor Coons' point about, the Koch brothers, the ways in which, conservative forces, hyper-conservative forces have, provided fuel for this violence. It's a convenient way of looking at this violence to say, oh, it was a lone wolf. It was just some guy and he was angry and he took things too far. That means nobody else is being held responsible. No institution, no other individual. So I think that those are very important. I also think, there's a huge, and I do not know the answer to this because the tech world, I actually work for a tech company technically, which owns the magazine that I run. They're going to fire me one day for talking crap about tech, but tech companies have a huge responsibility. And as we've seen, Facebook being the worst actor, arguably, in how they have policed or not policed hate speech and lies, but also the ways in which they have kowtowed to conservative forces that claim they're being targeted on social media, which is just demonstrably false. There were some really interesting reports recently in BuzzFeed. There are two reporters there who do a really, really good job covering Facebook. And actually, Adam Eaglin, my editor, our agent, he has two of his clients have a big book about Facebook coming out in the summer, I believe, that's about basically how screwed up Facebook is. But there's just a huge, so many decisions are being made there from political and financial, out of political and financial interests, as opposed to, real interest in truth and justice. So, that is something where I do not envy the people who have to make these decisions at tech companies, but, it certainly starts from a standpoint of reprioritizing what matters to those companies. And there's a good book called, I'm looking at my shelf, Antisocial by Andrew Marantz, who's a writer at The New Yorker. It came out in 2019, right? Sure. What is time, guys? I don't know anymore. But his book is basically about the rise of not just alt-right, but kind of these like conservative provocateurs. So like Mike Chernovich, Laura Loomer, like all these types. At the same, he calls them the gate crashers, at the same time that the people who became the ultimate gatekeepers of information in America were tech bros, for lack of a better way of putting it. And so it basically talks about how these two things collided and the gate crashers just overran the gatekeepers, because the gatekeepers, I don't know, overran is maybe a little too generous to the gatekeepers, but it's an interesting examination of the ways in which, technology and technology policy has really failed. So yeah, I mean, it's not just a governmental concern, it's also a private concern, it's a business concern. And I think that I certainly get overwhelmed when I think about all of the ways in which, one solution is not enough. And then, what about this? What about this? What about this? And so I try sometimes to say, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a tech executive. I'm not, I don't know, I'm not any number of things. I'm a journalist. What I can do is have conversations like this and, finding ways that instead of being overwhelmed by, by the lack of clarity in solutions, is finding a way to play a role in some part of it. To really think about it in a bigger sense. So yeah, I don't know if that's helpful. I'm sorry. Solutions really not my forte.
Oh, thank you.
How about a question from in the room? Anyone? Yeah, Andrew, go ahead. Oh, hold on just a sec. We're going to take one question from in the room and then we'll come back to you. Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, I know each interview you do is probably like a very separate experience, but have you had one that like sticks out in your mind as particularly unique or like had a very interesting backstory behind it? Like how they got to their alt-right views?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, everybody has a different story. And I think that this is actually to talk about solutions. There's not a rubric for how people become radicalized. It's not because they were raised by, very conservative or racist parents. It's not because they're from a particular part of the country. It's not even because they're financially vulnerable. I know that that's, something that in the news we hear a lot about, but actually data shows that some of the people who have the most exclusionary views of race in America are very financially comfortable. So, when you think about why people radicalize and therefore how they might be de-radicalized, it's a very individualized question. And so that is just to tag on to the solutions question. When we think about, how, for instance, do you pull someone from, a hate group or from believing QAnon or something along those lines? It's not a one size fits all solution. So to your question, I mean, I was always amazed by people who I saw myself reflected in, where, they were people who had some of the same women, especially, who had some of the same concerns I do about, having a voice and having agency and mattering and meaning. And then they just made a choice to go in a direction that, I really can't fathom. And so I guess one example, and she comes up in the book, but she's not a main character. So I'm gonna highlight her because you can read the book, you can read these like very in-depth stories of particular women, but I'll highlight this one because it's not in the book. So she went to college and got a graduate degree in the UK. I don't remember specifically like which university. And she really wanted to be a writer. She also wanted to work in museums. Like I think her graduate degree was at least partially in, museum, I don't know, curation. I don't quite know what these degrees are. But anyway, point being, like she had aspirations. She was, kind of intellectual. She, in the immediate post-grad period, so this is right on the heels of the financial crisis, And obviously, you know, tough time to find jobs as a young person, particularly someone who's interested in humanities. She was struggling to find a job. She was sending out resumes, cover letters. She identified more or less as, you know, feminist, pretty open-minded, and was simultaneously writing, so fiction writing. Couldn't get a job, couldn't get an agent, couldn't get a publisher. And so she did what, and this is, you know, certainly advice I would give to young writers, you know, you find ways to get your voice out there through more sort of democratized channels. So she had a blog, she had a vlog, where she was a part of the BookTube community, which was a like book reviewers on YouTube. And she created quite a little following. And she ultimately self-published 2 books, 3 books, I can't remember. They're kind of romantic fantasy historical, I don't know, it's it involves like vampires and castles and stuff, but anyway, I don't mean to minimize, I just don't actually know quite what the plots were. But in the midst of all of this, like if you watch, and I watched, you know, hundreds of hours of her on YouTube and like reading her social media content, you could sense her. And she had a very extensive Goodreads blog, for instance, as well, where she documented all of this. And, you know, her sense of frustration and alienation, and that she wanted more, and she thought she had followed all the rules that had been laid out for her, you know, by her higher education system, by, you know, family expectations, et cetera. And it just wasn't quite working out. And in 2015, I want to say, she posted a video on YouTube where she was responding to criticism that her fiction had received, her self-published fiction had received online, that it was too white, that it was, you know, it was just all white characters, and, you know, why didn't she have more diverse characters? And basically this angry rant on YouTube where she said, you know, there's nothing wrong with white characters. There's nothing wrong with having all white characters, basically, you know, arguing in defense of her, of the way she had approached fiction. Not that she had approached it from this like hyper racially aware sense, but I think she felt attacked by other people in this, you know, online book reviewing and writing community, who, you know, were basically telling her she wasn't woke. And that video led to a ton of backlash in this little community. Little is wrong, actually, it's a huge community. I mean, there's a lot of people who, you know, engage in this online writing and reviewing community. And that just heightened her sense of alienation and frustration. And in this time, far-right bloggers, vloggers, tweeters, whatever, got wind of this video and started championing it and saying, oh, she makes such good points, and inviting her onto their, you know, YouTube shows and things like that. And so she did a huge right turn, not to say that it was sudden, because I think she'd been, you know, going in this direction for a while, but here was a community that was embracing her and telling her that her views were perfectly acceptable. Not only that, they were righteous, they were important, they were about, you know, protecting white identity and the white race. And so then she became a very nasty, for lack of a better word, like one of the nastier like bloggers out there, for the far right. She ended up being introduced to her now husband, I assume they're still married, through Lana, the woman I was speaking to in Charleston. Lana was one of the people that kind of handpicked her out of the digital ether, and gave her a far right platform, introduced her to her now husband. And then she took this very interesting turn where she kind of disappeared online, which, you know, who knows what that means, right? But it's conspicuous for someone whose entire identity, and frankly, I think her income and other things were at this point tied to her far right identity online. She just vanished for several months. And when she resurfaced, Lana had her on her show. Also, I should say, I haven't said her name. I don't know why. She goes by the name Brie Fauché, which is not her real name, but that's the name she goes by online. So Brie resurfaces and is invited on Lana's program, Radio 314, which is on the platform she and her husband run called Red Ice. And it was kind of a welcome back. We know you've been gone, but over this time, like, you got married, and you know, congratulations to you. You seem so happy. And then there was a subtle mention made of some kind of bullying that she had endured. And the theory is, because Bree will not speak to me, she's told me hell no several times. But the theory, based on putting all the pieces together, is that she was getting bullied by misogynists on the far right for being vocal and unmarried. And this kind of gets into, you know, the ways in which women are expected to uphold traditional values in this space, to the point that, you know, she felt like she needed to go quiet for a while, but rather than say, oh, this space isn't really for me, I'm not being treated very well, she doubled down, and then reemerged married, and, you know, more palatable to the movement. So I found her trajectory fascinating for any number of reasons. And one of the things was that it was just so well documented that she had really, I mean, Professor Kuntz is a historian. She knows this word. I did not know this word before I started working on this project, which is ego documents. So if you go back, you know, in diaries that people have written, letters that they have written, if you're a historian, ego documents are, you know, these primary sources of people talking about themselves. And that is what blogs are, and that is what social media is. And she had just this prolific, you know, years worth of digital ego documents where you could see her frustration and alienation start to coalesce, and then you saw people taking advantage of that and offering her a place and an opportunity. So, you know, I've heard lots of people have told me their stories, and what was interesting about her is that, like, I had to kind of find it, but then when I did, it was quite extensive, and a really, like, helpful way of thinking about, you know, the unusual paths that people can take into this space.
Claudia, I see you have your hand raised. Do you want to make a comment?
I want to make a comment because I wanted to add that we're all frightened, but I have a note of optimism. And first of all of you should subscribe to Heather Cox Richardson's daily news feed. And today, Heather reports that a new survey, Caps Harris poll, says 61% of voters approve of Biden's performance so far. 55 also approve of the Democratic Party, up 7 points since January. Trump, the entire time he was president, never, ever on the Gallup poll, ever passed 50% approval. The only president in history since Gallup started counting who never once broke 50%. What that means is we have to get together to get rid of to support Biden and spend less time trying to convert people who I think cannot be converted. So that's what I was going to say. This is boring. But first of all, I take my cue from our local hero, Reverend William Barber. And Barber said his granddaddy told him that the dying mule always kicks the hardest. That's first of all. And secondly, the way to prevail, the way to win is and I'm saying it's boring because it really is. Knocking on doors, making telephone calls is really boring, but we're in North Carolina. We have to flip this state. We've got to win the next couple of elections. And Reverend Barber's point is, I think, well taken, and that is to deliver to people the kinds of results that Trump promised and never delivered on. That is, so people will say, and here I'm paraphrasing Reverend Barber, I hate them Dems. They're just a bunch of what you fill in the blank. But you know, I kind of like the healthcare, and I appreciated the check in my bank account. And well, this may, but you know, we're getting better COVID delivery here. So that's the kind of truly basic, boring groundwork we have to do. And I think our time is spent a lot better trying to recruit people from the edges of the Trumpist movement and just not worrying about the hardcore. There's nothing we can do about them. That's all. Boring, but I'm optimistic.
So we have the Nazi historian who's optimistic, Seyward. I don't know
I
what you're
know.
gonna do
I
with
mean,
that.
look, like I really admire that optimism. I wish I were an optimistic person, but I'm a catastrophist. So if I were to have a specialty, my specialty would be catastrophe.
Could I add one pitch for our since everybody here just about is local? If you're curious, just go to the website for Flip NC, FLIP-Flip NC. It's an indivisible organization. And what we always figure is knocking on doors and handing out leaflets is really boring, but it's an awfully wonderful antidepressant because you meet with other people who agree with you and you slog along, and it's great talking to people. And you only knock on Democratic doors. You do not ever try to convince anybody. If it's somebody who looks like a husband who's a GOP guy, you say, oh, have a wonderful day, bye. So you work on helping us and not defeating them.
Joe, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks so much for the research and for the presentation, the talk. I was wondering if you could comment some on the international elements of white supremacy, if there's connections between people in France, Britain, Norway, Hungary, and the United States, and how people are imagining kind of a white supremacist, global vision or, separatist kind of movement either.
Yeah, it very much exists. One of the moments that in my research, it actually wound up being like the opening anecdote in my Harper's piece is Lana speaking at a conference in Sweden. And part of that is because her husband is Swedish, but it's also because the far-right movement is quite robust in Nordic countries and in Northern Europe, but also, in other parts of Europe. And yeah, I think there are a lot of ties, organizationally in some cases, but it's more social in other cases, just, between people in places like Hungary, Spain, Australia, New Zealand, people communicating ideas, inviting each other on their, shows or whatever they might be, and organizing to a certain extent. But I think that really when I think about the internationalization of the movement, it's less about specific, institution building, and it's more just about sharing information. And so the example that comes to mind is when the mosque massacre happened in New Zealand, there was a data scientist, I think, who went and looked at that shooter's manifesto and compared it to rhetoric online by prominent far-right people, and sort of, almost like a genetic test, right? Like, what are the ways in which these are similar? And one of the people that his rhetoric was most similar to was Lana Locktough, the woman in my book. I assume these people never communicated with each other. I mean, we have Lana saying, never denounce an extremist on your side. But the point is that he was clearly consuming information that she was putting out into the world. So I think, it's something to be attentive to. But, I don't necessarily see some, sudden secessionist movement rising up in an organized way. And in large part, that's because, people in different countries have different interests. And, the things that white supremacists, for lack of a better way of putting it, in Hungary are concerned about are not the same as, white supremacists in Texas, California, New York. So I think, keeping tabs on certainly, where people go. And there have been, people banned from certain countries. I think Australia has banned a number of people actually from coming in and speaking. And being attentive to those types of things. But then, and this is really a technology and a tech regulation question of, what do you do about information flows, about conspiracy theories and, lies and whatnot, because those are borderless, basically.
A question from in the room. Zach, go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, thank you again. And I think that a lot of the things that you've said, and even some of the people that you spoke to, have implied not only the role of white conservatives, but the role of white liberals in upholding white supremacy in the United States. So I guess I was wondering, like, do you see yourself ever going down a path of exploring that? I mean, especially with the January 6th coup, I know that a lot of people have indicated just like, well, I mean, a lot of conservative rhetoric is, you know, oh, those libs do this and this and this, and liberals like pathologize us conservatives to believe so and be endemically stupid. So do you ever see yourself like exploring the way that white liberals in that sense are upholding white supremacy by, I don't know, giving fuel to the flames of white conservatives?
Yeah, wow, because I think there are two facets to that, because they give fuel to white conservatives by pathologizing and othering and mocking, and that is something, you know, I'm really not interested in, much to the chagrin of friends and family who do enjoy partaking in that kind of rhetoric. I find it dehumanizing, and I just don't engage. But I think the other piece of this is that, you know, white liberals do uphold white supremacy in ways that they probably don't realize. You know, whether you're talking about, you know, well-meaning white liberals who, you know, think they're saying and doing the right thing, but, you know, oftentimes are not and are perpetuating, you know, I don't know, systems of segregation. You know, I live in Brooklyn. I'm always astonished by, you know, this hyper like blue place, so to speak. But then like recently a parole center was being opened a couple of like a mile away. And it was this incredibly inconvenient place for anybody on parole. It was like not near public transportation. Like it was just this very like out of the way place. And all of a sudden you started seeing posters around Brooklyn that were like, not in my backyard. You know, so these people who are like, we have to protect our children. You know, I don't want this here. And it's like, they literally put it in the most inconvenient place possible. And like your concern is, you know, kind of this fear mongering around race and this like hyper gentrified borough. So that's a long way of saying, you know, I think that white liberals, and I count myself, you know, in this category, certainly, you know, dehumanizing, pathologizing, that just, you know, pours fuel onto a sense of grievance that I think is dangerous. But then also recognizing our own complicity in, you know, everyday ways of upholding white supremacy and pushing back against those things, and maybe things that we've kind of been conditioned to react in a certain way to certain, you know, developments, forces in the name of community safety, in the name of peacefulness, you know, any number of things. And thinking about how, you know, that is upholding white supremacy in its own way. So I guess to tie those two things together, what I'm saying is white liberals should not lie to themselves and say like, I have nothing to do with any of those systems that those people want to uphold, because we do, absolutely. And we're just shirking responsibility. And then on top of that, if we also otherize and you know, pathologize, we're pouring fuel. So, yeah, it's work, for lack of a better way of putting it. And some people are not interested in doing work, and I understand that. but you know, it's I think incumbent upon all white Americans, frankly, even if you think you're on the right side, and you are on the right side, you know, to be aware of the ways in which you know, you are more tied to systems of white supremacy than you think.
How about another question from online? Stephanie, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for coming today. I have a brief question that's related to Zach's. It kind of seems like whites get into white supremacy, white nationalism through these disinformation narratives that kind of activate their white identity online. So I wonder what your thought is on, not to get back to like the solutions framework, but to get back to the solutions framework, I wonder like if like censoring those websites and posts on social media is enough, and like if the media itself could maybe like reframe how it approaches maybe like policy issues, for example, like for example during COVID, how Black and Latinx Americans are disproportionately affected, to kind of unpack how the state doesn't redistribute resources or something like that. Like, could the media itself change its own narratives? Like, could that be a possible solution?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, to your first question, I think or first part of what you said, I think that was actually very well put. That, and this is something that is really important actually to say, is that people who become involved in the hate movement, who identify as white nationalists, who, kind of move through these channels, often do not get there because they are so much more racist than somebody else. And that woman who's the booktuber, I think, is a very good example of this. She was a white American who probably held biases that a lot of white Americans hold, but then it got activated by something else. Those things kind of got like brought to the surface and then became, her reason for being, for lack of a better way of putting it, or at least, reason for being an online animal creature, I should say, somebody whose existence is really there. And I think that's absolutely crucial, because it's not the people who might find, slide into, this worldview are not necessarily the people you assume they're going to be. And so I think thinking about white identity in that way, that it's something that can be activated. And to be clear, like, white identity is not necessarily like a bad thing. I, for instance, and you guys have a wonderful professor at your university, Ashley Jardina, who writes about white identity politics, and her book is, hugely insightful in describing the ways in which white identity has been, finding shape and finding political importance in the last couple of decades, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a question of how it's utilized. And so, I mean, to what I was just saying about, if white liberals could look at themselves as white and see, the ways in which they, are cogs in certain white supremacist institutions and machines and ways of thinking, and work to, improve that, like, that's activating white identity in like a positive sense. So I think there are absolutely ways in which, like, we could think of, whiteness and white identity as assets if people are willing to, interrogate them in the right ways. And what's tricky is that white supremacy says, why, yes, you do have a white identity. It's not something to interrogate. It's just something to embrace. It's just something to celebrate. You should be able to be like Black Americans. You should be able to be like Latino people. You should be able to be like, any number, like Native Americans, whatever. It's like, you should just be able to embrace that heritage. And this is a very reductive way of thinking about heritage, but this is the way they talk. And, just be able to be proud of that. And unfortunately, not unfortunately, it just is what it is. Like, that is not possible with white identity. Like, white identity and whiteness have been tools for so much wrong and so much oppression that if you're going to, really think about white identity, it just necessarily involves looking at those dimensions. And that's just the reality. Like, here we are, and this is what, where history put us. So I can see why that narrative of, just embracing whiteness and celebrating it can be very enticing to people, because it sounds like a nice way to have a community. Unfortunately, it's freighted with, a lot of violence and bias. But to your question about media reframing narratives, yes, God, yes. As someone who works in the media, we could do so much to reframe narratives and the way that we talk about things. And I work for I don't work for like a newsy publication. The magazine I work for has literally nothing to do with anything we've been talking about. We run long form narrative nonfiction, so sort of cinematic storytelling, not usually tied to the news. It's very fun. I enjoy it, and thankfully, it's a nice way to not think about neo-Nazis all the time. But the wider media apparatus, which I'm very connected to, just like professionally and through friends and whatnot, I think these conversations are happening constantly, where it's like, okay, how can we be? I feel like there was an impulse for a number of years in the media to say, oh, we need to deal with discrimination. We need to deal, with like historical legacies of racism. And they kind of siloed those things. And so they created like, verticals to talk about these issues, as opposed to, well, how do we just integrate them into the ways that we talk about every issue that we cover? Because, they often, touch the issues that we cover, if not, completely dictate the issues that we cover. And I think that there are places that are like doing better jobs of that, but God knows there's always more to do in terms of reframing narratives. And I think too, there's a pipeline issue where, particularly in legacy media institutions, and I certainly have like benefited from this. Like I'm maybe not in ways that I can like immediately point to, but like I certainly have, of, white journalists coming into the system and, being given opportunities that journalists of color are not given, or they have to work a million times harder for, or they have to get paid less along the way. And so there are absolutely pipeline issues that also need to be addressed, so that these ways of framing narratives in more equitable and progress oriented ways become more widespread. I also think, and it's interesting that Professor Kirk started with her, I don't know if you all heard this, but story about writing about a maybe murder for her college paper and trying to be as objective as possible and saying, the possible murder weapon was found stabbed into the person's chest, but we're not sure. It might be the murder weapon, not sure. This concern with objectivity is something, and this has been playing out a lot, particularly at the Washington Post, the New York Times to a certain extent, but the Washington Post I actually think has had more interesting conversations about this as an institution. Like, what is objectivity really? It's telling the truth, yes, but the truth does not mean giving every side equal weight. It does not mean not having, an opinion. Everybody has an opinion, and so, I guess here's a good example. At the Washington Post, they made a decision. During the BLM protests last summer, there were decisions made by a number of media institutions to capitalize the word Black, which I agree with. The Washington Post made the decision to also capitalize white, which I very much do not agree with, because I think that there's this like equivalence saying, well, this is the same thing as this, therefore we have to treat them the same, but they are not the same. They just, they are not. And that is not objectivity, that's actually false equivalence. Because white identity, as I was just saying, is so much more complicated. First of all, it's so much more malleable. Who counts as white in the context of America has changed so radically over time, and continues to change, frankly. And on top of that, like, whiteness as an identity has largely been wielded for negative, violent ends. And so to sort of treat them as the same, it diminishes, the history of what Black identity in America means. And it also plays into the hands of white supremacists who are interested in creating this equivalence on an identity spectrum. And so I think that, that's just a, rhetorical, or not rhetorical, but stylistic choice. But I think that points to this bigger issue of debates over what it means to be an objective, good, truth-telling journalist. And the parameters of that for so long have been set by white Americans, many of them very liberal, but they're in a position where it doesn't do them any harm to give equal weight to certain things, and who does it harm? And it often harms people who don't have power in newsrooms, and it harms people who are, being written about and the issues that matter to them. So these are very, very thorny issues, and I think ones that will be debated for the rest of certainly my career. But I think it's very, very important. And there are a couple of journalists of color who've done some really good writing on this. Wesley Lowery is one, and there's some others. Particularly, he's no longer at the Post, and he left largely for this reason. But it's definitely something I encourage you to, be aware of and keep tabs on the discussions people are having about the nature of objectivity and how objectivity can, in and of itself, be, a mode of power that people in dominant positions use to minimize other people's voices.
Well, we're at time now, so I just want to thank you, Seyward. That was wonderful. Please join me in thanking her. And the book is Sisters in Hate. You can see that lovely framed photograph of it over her.
Oh,
right
God, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, my mom and dad framed it, and the blank space next to it is for my husband's book, which also came out last year, but has not yet been framed. It's en route, I'm told.
Oh, good. Well, excellent. And it's you've got 10 of 10 on Zoom background, so excellent choices there. Thank you so much, Seyward. We'll be in touch soon.
All right, thank you, everyone.